Welcome to Welcome to One Work, Five Questions with David Dietrich and Dr. Mark Andrew Holacek. I am David Dietrich. I'm filling in for Donna Vitek, who is on scholarly hiatus. I am a docent at a Thomas Jefferson historical site, as well as an amateur published historian. Mark Holacek holds a PhD in history and philosophy. He taught at the University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, Rutgers University at Camden, and Ohio University. He has written 26 books on the life and times of Thomas Jefferson. Today's topic involves the discussion of a letter that Jefferson wrote to Henry Lee on the 10th of August, 1824, where he discusses a little bit about his views concerning republicanism and other forms of government. And we also are going to talk at that topic in a broader sense. So, Dr. Holacek, if you're ready, we'll go ahead and start.
I'm ready. So if you're Dave Dietrich, that makes me Mark Holacek, and we are ready to go. That covers the two of us on here.
Excellent. In case people
how was your what is today? How was your weekend? Did you have a good weekend?
Yeah, it was great. You can't complain. How was yours? You had a long drive.
I told you I was in Michigan. I went to a Ukrainian picnic and had a blast. I smoked 3 cigars and drank more beer than I should have drunk. But we had met family and friends, and it was just a lot of fun. So
that's great.
That was great. All right, I'm ready to go, I guess. Got a new background. This is my other residence in France.
Okay, and in case people get us mixed up, you're the older looking guy on the screen, right?
That's right, with all the gray hair.
There you go. All right, Dr. Holacek, would you begin by summarizing for the audience what is republicanism and federalism, what are republicanism and federalism, particularly as understood by Thomas Jefferson? And what we mean by that, we mean that within the context of the 10 August 1824 letter to Henry Lee, at least to a degree.
Well, I've written on this in a couple of books. I discussed this in my Disease of Liberty, which will be coming out in a few months. And when you read his discussion of republicanism in certain places, you get a sense that he's massively confused, because at times he speaks of republicanism as something monolithic, something block-like that all people need to share. And other times he talks about republicanism as contrasted with federalism. And, he's, in the first instance, he's sort of antithetical towards, federalist aims and goals. And in the second instance, he embraces federalism. So you want to say, and this is not just a matter of maturation of his thought over time, because he talks this way in earlier letters as far as at least 1785. So the question is Jefferson massively confused? I'll give you a taste of this. And we're not, I don't want to try to solve this right off the bat in the first question. We'll work our way through this. And before I come up with a solution, at least something that works in my head. 1789, he writes to Francis Hopkinson. He says, "I am not a Federalist because I never submitted the whole system of my opinions to the creed of any party of men whatever, in religion, in philosophy, in politics, or in anything else where I was capable of thinking for myself." And I like that line. I always say that myself when someone says, "Why aren't you a Republican?" or "Why aren't you?" Because I can think for myself, and I'm following Jefferson here, but it's a wonderful line. He says, "Such an addiction is the last degradation of a free and moral agent. If I could not go to heaven but with a party, I would not go there at all. Therefore, I protest to you, I am not of the party of Federalists." But then he adds, "But I am much farther from that of the anti-Federalists." Now, the Federalists were people in a matter of thought that the Confederation of Nations, right, that all states could retain their sovereignty, and yet there could be a confederation, right, with the Constitution. And the anti-Federalists just were anti-Constitution, right? In some sense, anti-Confederation too. So that's what he's talking about here. He's not talking about federalism and republicanism, because it's really not, those two parties aren't really in existence. But he says right at the end of the letters, these are my sentiments. I was right in saying I'm neither Federalist nor anti-Federalist. I am of neither party, nor yet a trimmer between parties, right? So off the bat, and then he's got these other letters in which we'll delve, where he's talking about, to Joel Barlow in 1802 while he's president. He says, as the division into Whig and Tory, which is Republican or Federalist, is founded in the nature of man, the weakly and nerveless, the rich and the corrupt, seeing more safety and accessibility in a strong executive, a healthy firm and the healthy firm and virtuous in contrast, feeling the confidence in their physical and moral resources, and willing to part with only so much power as is necessary for good government. He's talking about this rooted in nature, and he doesn't paint the Tories or the Federalists in a nice light. So he's talking about them as something constitutionally or naturally grounded. And so we've got this difficulty here. I'll leave it at that for the first question, right? And then as we get on, I've seen your other two questions. I can expound and try to answer more fully that question.
Okay, should we move on to 2, or you want
Let's
to
move on to 2.
Okay, great. Now, how did Thomas Jefferson's understanding of these terms and concepts, and by that again, republicanism and federalism, how did they vary from those of others in his day? Those terms must have been, at least among the well-informed, must have been pretty common and commonly understood, perhaps. Where was Jefferson in sync with the other folks, and where was he in maybe see it a different way? If we know that, maybe we don't know it.
Well, these were federalism, republicanism were not terms that were commonly accepted at all. They were really terms that came about because of the tension between Hamilton and Jefferson as part of George Washington's administration. And, Hamilton called his party or the Federalists, and republicanism, I think you made a point to me in private, which is correct, really came about as a response to Jefferson's antipathy for what Hamilton was doing with federalism. Federalism involved, central bank, national debt, strong sort of arbitrary central authority, strong arbitrary powers to the president, the ability to, when the Constitution comes about, the ability to interpret the Constitution pretty much any way you want for the betterment of the general public. Public welfare clause, right, according to Hamilton, literally meant I'm going to interpret it any way I want because, well, the people are really too stupid to know what's in their best interest, so you need strong, and Adams was part of this too, you need smart, intelligent people to decide on behalf of the masses, of the hoi polloi, to use a Greek term, the many, right? So, and Jeffersonian republicanism is demassified, thin government, spread out, not powerful, strict construction of the Constitution against federal banks, against strong military, standing armies, and things like that. What Hamilton was trying to do is Hamilton literally thought that the British government was the greatest government in the history of the world, and it was perfect the way it was. He said that to Jefferson on one occasion. Even with its flaws, it's perfect. There's no need to change anything about it. Hamilton was trying to develop a strong government, and like I said, somewhat arbitrary powers of the executive, the controlling part of the government. And Jefferson objected to that. For him, government was of and by the people through elected representatives. The representatives were not necessarily trustworthy over time. They were recallable by the people. So Jefferson insisted that people needed a modicum of education. As you mentioned, these elected people were elected on account of their virtue, presumably for Jefferson. People had a moral sense, and by virtue of their own moral sense, they could know when someone through sensing when someone was a virtuous person. And they're also selected on account of their genius. And genius doesn't mean what it means for us today. It meant their intelligence, high intelligence level. So Jefferson thought, that government needed to be demassified, and Hamilton thought it needed to be centralized and strong. And that was the whole problem between states' rights and a strong federal government for Hamilton, and problem between Hamilton and Jefferson. And Jefferson just worried about the corruptive effect of titanolatry, love of power, and what that would do to people. In that, when you put power, the lesson of history is when you put power in the hands of a few people or one person, that person's going to abuse the power. So
I've always thought it's been interesting that Jefferson's friend Madison wrote about what he termed the Aristoi and the pseudo-Aristoi. And by those terms, of course, he meant what you were hinting at, that there is a group of folks that are virtuous and intelligent. They are the natural aristocracy in that context, the natural Aristoi. Now, they can be voted into office by the people, but they're presumably the people who weren't operating at kind of a higher level. And then the pseudo-Aristoi, which were those people who kind of crave power and are there because of connections and so forth and so on, wealth maybe, and not necessarily the most virtuous and the most polymathic people available. And so I just find that interesting.
They're not the most polymathic.
They're not, correct.
Okay.
Yes, that's absolutely true. So, I just wonder if that, you can almost sense that Jefferson kind of harbored those ideas as well.
Well,
at least in general terms.
Specifically when pushed by Adams, because Adams writes on the constitutions of the United States and discourses on the villa. And Adams' view is always that wealth, birth, and to a third extent, looks are going to be the deciding factors in how people decide who's going to be, governing them. And whether you like it or not, Adams is appealing to past history, is that this is the way things have always been. It's the way things always are. And Jefferson is proposing a radical sea change here. He's thinking that no, if you get rid of the political biases that enable people to persevere through wealth through generations, where the wealth is maintained within a particular family, we're going to break down those political biases, and we're going to allow for the best qualified people. So Jefferson's republicanism demands that the people best qualified, you're polymathic, the most intelligent, the most virtuous, are going to be running, and they're going to be running for the most part at their own expense, right? So, it's a matter of philocracy, which is a love of power, versus democracy, which is a power in the hands of the many, of the people. And with the understanding democracy was a pejorative term in Thomas Jefferson's day, right? By that, it just wasn't, it was used in a negative sense. People don't, pejorative means, I don't know what it means myself either, but I just use it.
Okay. You ready to go to three? Question three?
Yeah, and I still haven't answered, I think, your first question. I'll try to do that. But
okay. Well, if you want to revisit that at any time, just go ahead and do so.
Well, yes, I told you before, we'll try to have everything sewn up by the third question and stuff. Because I looked at the first three, and they're sort of mutually enforcing or something like that.
Okay. For three, you wrote that Jefferson thought federalism and republicanism were mutually exclusive political alternatives. What do you assess that? Why do you assess that? And would you elaborate on that?
In my short paper called Jefferson's Textured Republicanism, I tried to disambiguate the term republicanism and clear up the confusion. There is, in a sense, as I mentioned in the first question, he's talking about when he talks of federalism, he generally talks about it in a very pejorative sense, and he's always talking about political republicanism is something that is necessarily better. Let's look at the Henry Lee letter, right? Let's go to the letter that we're looking at. If you go to the top, I think I gave you something we could see. He says, men by their constitutions are naturally divided into two parties. One, those who fear and distrust the people and wish to draw all powers, that's what I call philocracy, from them into the hands of the higher classes. Secondly, those who identify themselves with the people, have confidence in them, cherish and consider them as the most honest and safe, although not most wise depository of public interest. And notice that concession, although not necessarily the most wise depository of public interest. In every country, these two parties exist, and in every one where they are free to think, speak, and write, they will declare themselves. Now, that's certainly not like, Jefferson talking about in that earlier letter to Hopkinson, that I am not partisan in the least. Well, in some sense, he's not, but in this letter to Lee, he's talking about there are constitutions, men by their constitutions are divided into two parties. And let me read a couple more quotes. TJ to John Cartwright, 1824, natural. He writes, it has ever appeared to me that the differences between Whig and Tory, Republican and Federalist of England is that the Whig deduces his rights from the Anglo-Saxon source, the Tory from the Norman, right? William Short, 1825. We all know about Jefferson's Anglo-Saxon roots. Men, according to their constitutions and the circumstances in which they're placed, differ honestly in opinion. Some are Whigs, Liberals, Democrats, call them what you please. Others are Tories, serviles, aristocrats, etc. Notice he puts the word serviles in there. The latter fear the people and wish to transfer all power to the higher classes of society. The former consider the people as the safest depository of power in the last resort. They cherish them, therefore, and wish to leave in them all the powers to the exercise of which they're competent. Now, he calls this division the most salutary of all divisions. And I want to, so what's going on here? I think what's going on is that the differences of opinion Jefferson had with Hamilton were at the philosophical level. Hamilton is arguing philosophically that all people are power hungry and everything. So he adopts a position of government that the most powerful, the strongest, the wealthiest people need to run all things. And federalism is based on those assumptions. And then once he delivers a party platform for federalism, we get the beginning of Jeffersonian republicanism. But there are two senses of republicanism. When Jefferson's arguing with Hamilton, I think, is arguing politically, and Jefferson's arguing philosophically, right? And what I think goes on is that Jefferson takes what he thinks is philosophically important, and he acknowledges that certain things need to be put into place in any government, any healthy government. Namely, people need to be free. They need to have their rights guaranteed. That government, they need to elect their representatives, whether they're an aristocracy or not. And those elected should be recallable. But government is for the sake of the people and their rights, not government for the sake of those who are running things, like the king or the aristocracy. So his is a bottom-up driven thing. Hamilton's is a top-down driven, sort of a Hobbesian. The king is infallible. He is ordained by God. And so what Jefferson acknowledged just when he talks about constitutional differences, and let me go to share screen here if I can. Right, we get this whole notion of, he writes in 1785 to the Marquis de Chastellux. He talks about Northerners and Southerners. Northerners are cool, Southerners fiery, obviously because the heat comes up. Northerners are sober, Southerners voluptuary. Northerners laborious, they work in their factories. Southerners lazy, again, the heat, they have slaves do the work. Northerners persevering, Southerners unsteady. Both are independent, right? And he has to have that because he's arguing Americans are the most independent of all people because they have their rights guaranteed constitutionally through the Bill of Rights. So that's what differentiates Americans from all other people is the essential independence of the Constitution. Northerners jealous of their own liberties, just to others' liberties. Southerners zealous of their own liberties, trampling on others' liberties. Northerners interested, and that by that he means self-interested. Southerners generous. Northerners chicaning. Southerners candid. Northerners superstitious and hypocritical in religion. Southerners attached only to the religion of the heart. By that he means they're attached to morality as being a religion. I'm going to close that off now. And so that's what we have. He thinks in some sense, and this is following the Hippocratic physicians BC, right around Aristotle's time, that and Panaetius, the Greek philosopher, the Stoic philosopher, who talked about men, wearing four hats, one of which is the biological self, the constitution I have. I might be fiery by nature and angry and independent. Other people are calm and passive, but then my circumstances allow me to act in a certain way or forbid me to act in a certain way, and so forth. And then there's my moral self and so forth. The idea being here in Jefferson is drawing from that is that there are constitutional differences. And Jefferson literally thinks following the Hippocratic physicians, climate comes into play. If I live in the hot South, I'm going to be lazy by disposition because it's darned hot. That's all. And in the North, things are going to be different and so forth. So obviously, following the Greek medialism, he thinks the best sort of climate would be somewhere in between. Where is that? It's in Virginia, right in the middle somewhere. Pennsylvania, maybe even a little higher. I think he talks about Pennsylvania as being ideally located. So you have to be, what does Mediterranean mean? Any Middle Earth, Mediterra, the Middle Earth, perfectly climate. So in some sense, I'm arguing Jefferson, thinks that, that there are constitutional differences, that any good political system is going to need these people who are federalists, who are, and then need people who are Republicans, right? And it's good for both of these parties to exist within the framework of a Republican-like system, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And, it got me to thinking as you were talking about that one of the some of the more recent scholarship that might actually kind of reinforce Jefferson's assessment of the divergent backgrounds. There was a book created actually a couple decades ago called All Beyond Seed. And the author put forward the idea that Northerners and Southerners have different roots in England. And so, surprise, surprise. And the short of it is that up north, the large amount of people originated from East Anglia. Right. And in the south, it was from Saxony, not in Germany, but Saxony, southern England. And that they brought with them different ways of life. I'm sorry?
You also had a large influx of Irish and Scottish people in the south.
Correct.
This is exactly. A thesis also put forward by Forrest McDonald, who's a friend of mine.
So Celts.
Yeah.
So you got a mixture of all that. So, and some historians have even argued that the American Civil War was an extension of the English Civil War, the Roundheads and the Cavaliers. Who knows?
But it's a very suggestive and tantalizing hypothesis, isn't it? It's at least worth mulling through.
Yep.
Yeah, I've read that too by a different source, but I find it very, very tantalizing, very interesting hypothesis. And
so the reason I'm bringing these up simply is that other other scholars and historians have sort of seen what Jefferson wrote about, maybe for different reasons, but there might be something to that.
Oh yeah, but look at the different. There's no question that the way of life in the South has been, and to some extent continues to be, much different. Hierarchies are so important in the South, where it's not much at all important. They don't think hierarchically, just in terms of, take a plantation in the South. What you have is you have hierarchies within the white parts of the family. Within the domestic environment, you have hierarchies outside, and then you have white and black hierarchy with slave and masters and so forth, and even white slaves at times. But the Southerners thought in terms of hierarchies all the time. It was just natural. If you offended me, you're a fellow Southerner, and you own 10 slaves, and I own 200 slaves, I'm not going to fight you because I'm battling with someone much beneath me, much inferior. You're not a planter. I am a official planter with the number of slaves. You are a wannabe planter or something. So it offends me. It's an offense on my dignity to share pistols with you. Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up. I'm very intrigued by that thesis. And I think that certainly is part of the explanation of the Civil War that people are starting to look at. And I'm glad they are.
Okay, on to number 4. And this is, I guess, where it gets into speculative type questions.
You know how I love that.
In your view, how would Jefferson's view of American governance, let me rephrase that, based on what we have discussed about Jefferson and his views on republicanism and federalism and the like, in your view, how would you see Jefferson reacting to American governance today? What would his thoughts be on what we're seeing today, or what we've seen?
Do you want to answer that for me? Because I think you know what I'll say.
No, I'll sit back and listen.
Well, I'll answer briefly, and you can add to it.
Okay.
I think he would think nothing of what he saw. I've said before, he might say, "Get your muskets and let's overthrow the government." The government, regardless of what's going on with the two parties, the infighting is so bad. The only thing that the partisan people think about, the people in the parties think about, is who's going to dominate the Senate, the House, and who's going to be the next president. And in large part, I think Democrats and Republicans have forgotten that government is governed by the people. They do so much squabbling among themselves. It's a blame game. If you're a Democrat, the Republicans are responsible for all the ills in government. If you're a Republican, no one is addressing the problems directly, right? We're blaming the other party for not solving the problems or for having bad solutions, and nothing really gets done. So he would go back to what he said about in his earlier quote, if I can only go to heaven by partisanship with respect to a political party, I would rather not go at all. The letter to Francis Hopkinson. I just think he would see the partisanship as being cancerous, and he would. And there's, of course, the indolence of the people. Remember, one aspect of Jeffersonian Republican, a very vital aspect, is that if you're going to have government of and by the people, people, even if they're not directly involved in governing, need to be involved in jury duty, need to be involved in local elections, and they need to be involved as much as they can in government. There is an indolence or a lack of concern. You can blame it on the governing people themselves, the governors, that they've just taken control of the situation and shut out. But I think there's a source of lethargy in the people themselves, and unwillingness to get involved. So
I get the impression that perhaps if Jefferson were looking at American governance today, he would in many ways see a validation of his views. That maybe to him it would be the validation of those views on steroids, but at least there, the tension, for example, between, well, heck, I'll say it, Republicans and Federalists. We still have that in a sense, do we not? And maybe Jefferson would see that. I don't know.
Well, he certainly would not have seen the sort of runaway capitalism we have with the special interest groups. He didn't anticipate that. He didn't, the extent to which special interests, the extent to which corporate money influences political decisions. And, I don't think he ever never thought that could happen. So how would he respond to that? And then one response is you have to have political intervention in terms of to prohibit corporations from influencing things. But of course, he was against big government. That just means stronger government,
Yeah.
So there are a lot of problems with that. I think I'll say one thing, he would be excited by the science and the technological advances, artificial intelligence, what we know about space. I think maybe he would drop out of politics and become a practicing scientist, right?
Wouldn't shock me.
Wouldn't shock me either.
And this is kind of related to that question here. And this is, again, a speculative type of question. And that is, in your understanding of Jefferson's thinking, what do you see that he would likely believe today in terms of the liberty of the people? In other words, would he see that as being strengthened, having been greatly weakened, maybe lost, maybe humming along beautifully? I mean, what are your thoughts on that based on what we know about the way Jefferson thought?
Well, I answered part of this in the last question, but liberty entails responsibilities, right? If you think freedom means freedom to do whatever you want, whenever you want, that's certainly not anything that Jefferson envisaged and he thought was worthwhile. He thought, well, if you want to be able, we have the political liberties. I talk of 4 different types of liberties, 2 political, freedom from, which is the main thing, right? Freedom from governmental intervention telling you how to live your lives. They don't have that in China. They don't have that in Russia, right? And we might even say we don't have that fully in the United States. And then freedom to. Freedom to means the capacity, once freedom from is in place, the capacity to choose between viable in life-enhancing opportunities, right? I use the example, if I go into a candy store and they sell milk duds and only milk duds, and the person who takes the little boy in the candy store and says you can buy whatever you want. Well, if they only sell milk duds, it's not much of a choice. Pretty disgusting choice anyway. So and that's why Jefferson thought in his second inaugural address there needed to be a certain amount of infrastructure, roads and railways and canals and things like that to connect the states, to allow people greater passage from one place to the next and so forth. And in the other sense, he talks of what I call voluntary or agentive liberty of the agent, my ability to make choices and act on those choices. And that can be broken down, I break down into moral liberty as well as amoral liberty. Moral liberty being the ability to think about possible courses with moral implications and act about, well, Jefferson doesn't think morality is a matter of thinking, it's a matter of feeling. But I am free to feel my way through moral decision making. And then there's, of course, amoral activities where I can choose, say I've got time to kill, I can choose to count the freckles on my forearm, or I can choose to see how much Pepsi I can drink, in 15 minutes. Neither one, for the most part, has any discernible moral implications, but they're called adiaphonos, following, the Stoic philosophy. Actions that are neither moral nor immoral. So one might make the case, and I think you could make the case very easily, that there are no real adiaphonos acts, that every action you pursue or every choice you make in some sense has a moral implication of some sort. So, but I think those are the four types of things. And has liberty been lost? Yes, liberty in this country is lost, because I think the American ideal today is looking upon freedom as just my right to do whatever I want to do. And we go back to what John F. Kennedy says: "Ask not what you can do for your what your country can do for you, but what you There's a give and take. You can't have these freedoms if you don't work for them, if you don't fight for them, if you don't look what's going on with Ukraine and Russia. Why are Ukrainians fighting so valiantly? Because they're fighting there for their property, their land, their life. They're fighting so that someone doesn't dictate to them how they have to live, in what manner they have to live, and so forth. And sometimes it's very easy to fight like that. In some sense, you can argue the American Revolution, I don't know what your view is, but I think the American Revolution was fought over that, the whole notion of whether we want to be free people or encumbered by certain laws and things that are imposed on us, certain acts by an outside force where we have no possibility of participating in the government, in the decision whether or not we ought to be taxed and things like that. So I think it was fought for liberty, for freedom. And Jefferson would think, yeah, we have lost our liberty. So we're down about 2.5 minutes here. Yeah, I mean, you want to add to that before we close up and you tell us what we're going to do next week?
Oh, wow.
Well, it's time to, what do you think of that, the notion? If you want to put your 2 cents in, I would appreciate hearing what you have to say on.
I'm trying to think of what would be a good, would be interesting, I think. How about looking at Jefferson's views of the French Revolution? He was there at least at the outset of it, and he knew a lot of the movers and shakers. In fact, some of his colleagues over there actually, they got caught up in that and lost their lives. It would be interesting to think that, to contemplate what he thought about that, both good and bad, and whether that was something that was mirroring the American experience, or something that was just an incredible bad aberration.
Well, he hoped it would mirror the American experience, and time proved him wrong. Time proved that the French Revolution, because the people were so mired in a cultural milieu in which there were these hierarchies, their love of power, and the peasants did not know what it meant to be free. It just was a radically different culture, and the revolution could not work the way that it worked here. Right?
Yeah.
It didn't have those sort of hierarchies.
But that's just something that I'm throwing out as a possibility.
Yeah, no. It's something we can do. What are we doing next week? Do you have anything slated up there?
No, not right now at this point, but I'll get something out soon.
A suggestion was a letter on something on Jefferson and farming. Talk about Jefferson and farming. Maybe we'll do that next week. I have in mind this 1794 letter that we might be able to do, where Jefferson talks about his approach to farming, and it gives us a dimension of another access to Jefferson's mind.
Yeah, that's right. I apologize. I forgot about farming to John Taylor.